The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the USS New Jersey as Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr. stared through his binoculars at the distant horizon. It was October 20th, 1944, and the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance like a sword. Suspended by the thinnest of threads, the largest naval battle in history was about to unfold in the waters surrounding the Philippine archipelago, and every man aboard the massive fleet knew that failure here would extend the war by years, costing countless American lives. The air was thick with anticipation as thousands of vessels stretched across the Philippine Sea. In what would become known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Admiral Chester William Nimitz had orchestrated this massive undertaking with the precision of a master chess player, positioning his pieces for what he hoped would be checkmate against the Imperial Japanese Navy. The stakes could not have been higher. Control of the Philippines meant control of Japan's vital supply lines and the beginning of the end for the Empire of the Rising Sun. General Douglas MacArthur had promised to return to the Philippines, and now that promise was being fulfilled with the thunder of 1,000 guns and the roar of aircraft engines that filled the tropical air. The Japanese, desperate to maintain their grip on their conquered territories, had committed nearly every remaining vessel in their once mighty fleet to this final gamble. What they called Operation Victory One represented their last hope of turning the tide of a war that had been slowly slipping from their grasp since the disaster at Midway 2 years earlier. Captain Ernest Edwin Evans of the USS Johnston felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he surveyed his crew preparing for battle. These were not the seasoned veterans who had begun the war. Many of those brave souls now rested beneath Pacific waters. Instead, his ship was manned largely by young men who had learned their trade in the crucible of war, boys who had become men under the relentless pressure of combat against a determined and skilled enemy. The intelligence reports painted a grim picture of Japanese intentions. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the Center Force, a formidable collection of battleships including the mighty Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever constructed. These floating fortresses, with their 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells the weight of automobiles over 20 miles, represented the pinnacle of naval engineering and the desperate fury of a cornered empire. According to detailed analysis from the Naval War College Review, the Japanese had committed over 60 major warships to this operation, marking the largest deployment of their remaining fleet. As radio chatter filled the communication centers of the American fleet, commanders at every level understood that the next 72 hours would determine not just the outcome of the Philippine campaign, but potentially the duration of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. They would strike at the vulnerable landing forces at Leyte Gulf, while the main American battle fleet was drawn away by diversionary attacks. Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, one of the escort carrier groups tasked with providing air support to the landing forces, had no idea that his small force of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers would soon face the full might of the Japanese center force in a battle that would become legend. The pre-dawn darkness of October 23, 1944, was shattered by the urgent wheel of general quarters aboard the USS Daughter. Commander David Howard McClintock peered through the periscope at what appeared to be a fleet of ghosts materializing from the morning mist. The Japanese center force, led by Admiral Takeo Kurita, was steaming directly toward the American submarines lying in wait along the Palawan Passage, like steel sharks in the deep. Lieutenant Commander Reginald Marbury Raymond aboard the USS Dace confirmed what McClintock was seeing: the largest collection of Japanese warships either submarine commander had ever encountered. The heavy cruisers Otago, Maya, and Takao led the formation, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable even in the dim light of early morning. Behind them followed the massive bulk of the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, their pagoda-like superstructures rising like ancient temples from the sea. The first torpedo strikes came at 6:32 in the morning, catching the Japanese completely by surprise. The Otago, flagship of Admiral Kurita himself, took for torpedo hits and began listing heavily to port. The explosion that followed when her magazines detonated could be heard for miles, sending a column of smoke and flame reaching toward the heavens like a funeral pyre. For Japanese naval supremacy, Admiral Kurita, thrown into the warm waters of the South China Sea, was rescued by a destroyer. But his flagship and many of his staff officers were gone forever. Within minutes, the Maya followed her flagship to the bottom, torn apart by multiple torpedo hits from the Dace. The Takao, though heavily damaged and taking on water, managed to limp away from the killing ground, escorted by 2 destroyers. In less than an hour, the Japanese had lost the heavy cruisers and saw a third crippled, while the American submarines escaped undetected into the depths. News of the successful submarine attack reached Admiral Halsey aboard the New Jersey, as his fast carriers prepared to launch their own strikes against the approaching Japanese forces. The Third Fleet, comprising for task groups with a total of 8 heavy carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, represented the most powerful naval force ever assembled under the American flag. Historical records from the National Archives indicate that Halsey commanded over 100 vessels in his pursuit of the Japanese fleet. The airstrikes began at dawn on October 24th, wave after wave of Grumman Hellcats, Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, and Grumman Avenger torpedo planes rising from the decks of American carriers to seek out the enemy. The Japanese center force, now under the command of Admiral Kurita from his new flagship Yamato, fought desperately to reach its objective while under constant air attack. The mighty Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato and pride of the Japanese fleet, became the primary target of American air attacks. Throughout the long day of October 24th, she absorbed hit after hit from bombs and torpedoes, her massive armor plating proving inadequate against the concentrated fury of American air power. By mid-afternoon, the great ship was listing heavily and falling behind the formation, her speed reduced to a crawl by the tremendous damage she had sustained. Captain Toshihira Inoguchi, commanding the doomed battleship, refused repeated suggestions to abandon ship. As the sun began to set over the Philippine Sea, the Musashi finally capsized and sank, taking with her over 1,000 officers and men. The loss of this symbol of Japanese naval might sent shockwaves through the Imperial Navy and marked the beginning of the end for their surface fleet. Admiral Kurita, seeing his force decimated by air attacks and facing the prospect of night action against prepared American forces, made the difficult decision to reverse course and withdraw temporarily, hoping to regroup and attack at dawn. The crimson sunset of October 24th, 1944, painted the Philippine Sea in shades of blood as Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's northern force approached from the north, flying the flags of for aircraft carriers that had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, led a collection of ships that represented nothing more than an elaborate deception, a sacrificial offering designed to lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the crucial landing areas at Leyte Gulf. Ozawa's carriers were virtually empty of aircraft, their hangars echoing with the silence of defeat. The once mighty Japanese naval aviation arm had been systematically destroyed in the grinding battles of the previous 2 years, leaving these floating airfields as little more than expensive decoys. Yet their very presence on the tactical plot boards aboard American flagships created exactly the reaction the Japanese High Command had hoped for. Admiral Halsey took the bait with the enthusiasm of a veteran angler seeing the fish of a lifetime. The brilliant tactical mind that had earned Halsey the nickname Bull proved to be both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. When reconnaissance aircraft reported the Japanese carriers to the north, every instinct bred into him through decades of naval service screamed that here was the primary threat. Carriers had dominated naval warfare since Pearl Harbor, and the opportunity to destroy the remaining Japanese flight deck seemed valuable to ignore. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive 15-volume history of United States naval operations in World War II, Halsey's decision to pursue the Japanese carriers with his entire force would become one of the most controversial tactical decisions of the Pacific War. At 11 o'clock that night, Halsey issued the orders that would leave the landing forces at Leyte Gulf, protected only by Admiral Thomas Lunsford Kincaid's 7th Fleet and the small escort carrier groups known collectively as the Taffies. Meanwhile, Admiral Kurita had rallied his battered center force and was making his second approach toward San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness. The narrow passage between the islands of Luzon and Samar had been left unguarded by Halsey's departure, creating a gap in American defenses that the Japanese commander intended to exploit at first light. His remaining force still packed considerable punch for battleships including the massive Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers to light cruisers, and 11 destroyers represented enough firepower to devastate the vulnerable transports and landing craft in Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Southern Force, commanded by Admiral Shoji Nishimura, was simultaneously approaching through Surigao Strait at the southern end of Leyte Gulf. This smaller force of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers was steaming directly into the prepared positions of Admiral Jesse Bartlett Oldendorf's Battle Line 6 battleships. most of them survivors of Pearl Harbor seeking revenge, supported by 8 cruisers and numerous destroyers. The night air was filled with the tension of impending battle, as radar operators aboard American ships tracked the approaching Japanese formation. The Fuso and Yamashiro, both elderly battleships dating from the First World War, led Nishimura's force through the narrow waters where American PT boats waited in ambush, like wolves preparing to strike at a passing deer. At 3:09 in the morning of October 25th, the destroyer USS Melvin launched the first torpedoes of what would become known as the Battle of Surigao Strait. The perfectly executed night action that followed would demonstrate American naval supremacy in its most devastating form, as radar-controlled gunfire and coordinated torpedo attacks systematically destroyed the Japanese southern force. The battleship Fuso exploded in a fireball that illuminated the night sky, while the Yamashiro was pounded into a sinking wreck by the concentrated fire of Oldendorf's battle line. By dawn, the southern force had been virtually annihilated, but the real threat was approaching from the north, as Admiral Kurita's center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait to find the horizon filled with the silhouettes of what they believed to be Halsey's main fleet. The first gray light of October 25, 1944, revealed a scene that would have been comical if the stakes had not been so desperately high. Admiral Clifton Albert Frederick Sprague's Taffy III, consisting of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers, found themselves face to face with the full might of Admiral Kurita's center force, emerging from San Bernardino Strait like ancient sea monsters rising from the depths. The Yamato, her massive 18-inch guns capable of hurling armor-piercing shells weighing as much as small automobiles, opened fire at a range of 20 miles. The colored splashes of her ranging shots, red, green, yellow, and blue dyes marking different ship salvos, began walking toward the American escort carriers like the footsteps of approaching doom. The sight of those towering waterspouts, some reaching heights of several hundred feet, sent chills through even the most hardened veterans aboard the American ships. The Johnston, displacing barely 2,300 tons and armed with 5-inch guns that seemed pitiful compared to the massive weapons facing them, charged toward the Japanese battle line like a terrier attacking a pack of wolves. Behind him, the destroyers Hull and Heermann followed suit, their crews knowing that they were sailing into the jaws of certain death. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, commanded by Captain Walter Vernu Rainer Vugue, desperately tried to escape the pursuing Japanese cruisers, but her maximum speed of 17 knots made her an easy target for the enemy's 30-plus knot pursuit. 8-inch shells from the heavy cruiser Chikuma began finding their mark, tearing great holes in her flight deck and starting fires that sent columns of black smoke bellowing across the sea. The sight of the small carrier taking hit after hit, while her crew fought desperately to save their ship, became a symbol of American determination. In the face of overwhelming odds, aboard the Johnston, Captain Evans called out fire control solutions personally as his ship's 5-inch guns engaged targets that outweighed his vessel by a factor of 10 to 1. The Native American officer, whose ancestors had fought against impossible odds on countless battlefields, embodied the fighting spirit that would carry American forces to victory. When enemy shells destroyed his ship's bridge and severed his left hand, he continued to command from the after-steering station, his uniform soaked in blood, but his determination unshaken. According to the official action report filed with the Bureau of Naval Personnel, the destroyers of Taffy III fired every torpedo they carried and expended virtually all of their ammunition in a running battle that lasted over 2 hours. The Hull, commanded by Commander Leon Samuel Kintberger, absorbed over 40 major caliber hits before finally succumbing to the overwhelming firepower arrayed against her. As she slipped beneath the waves, her surviving crew members could see the Johnston still fighting, her guns blazing defiance at the Japanese heavy cruisers. The aircraft launched from the escort carriers joined the desperate battle, making repeated attacks against the Japanese ships. Despite having been armed primarily for anti-submarine warfare rather than surface action, pilots dropped depth charges on battleships, strafed bridge structures with machine gun fire, and made dry runs when their ammunition was exhausted, anything to distract and delay the enemy advance toward the vulnerable landing areas. The most incredible moment came when the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, attempting to pursue the fleeing escort carriers, found herself bracketed by accurate 5-inch gunfire from the tiny destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. Lieutenant Commander Robert Wythoff Copeland had ordered his 1,350-ton vessel, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, into action against a cruiser that outgunned and outweighed her by an enormous margin. The sight of this David engaging Goliath inspired even the Japanese, who later spoke with admiration of the American fighting spirit. As the morning wore on and the battle reached its climax, Admiral Kurita faced a decision that would determine the outcome of the entire Philippine campaign. His ships had suffered significant damage from the desperate American attacks, and the ferocity of the resistance convinced him that he was facing a much larger force than intelligence had indicated. At 9:23 in the morning of October 25, 1944, Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the Yamato and made the most controversial decision of his naval career. With Leyte Gulf and its vulnerable American transports less than 40 miles away, he ordered his battered but still formidable center force to break off the attack and withdraw. The decision would haunt him for the rest of his life and mark the turning point of the entire Battle of Leyte Gulf. The factors influencing Kurita's decision were complex and rooted in the fog of war that had descended over the chaotic battle. His force had been under continuous air attack for over 24 hours, losing the super battleship Musashi and suffering damage to virtually every remaining ship. The ferocious resistance put up by Taffy III had convinced him that he was facing Halsey's main fleet rather than a handful of escort carriers and destroyers. Radio intercepts suggested that American fast carriers were approaching from the south, threatening to trap his force in the confined waters of Leyte Gulf. The heavy cruiser Suzuya had just exploded. Under repeated air attacks, her magazines detonating in a fireball visible for miles. Even the mighty Yamato bore scars from the morning's action, her superstructure pockmarked by hits from 5-inch shells that, while unable to penetrate her armor, had demonstrated the accuracy and determination of American gunnery. Captain Evans Johnson had finally succumbed to the overwhelming firepower arrayed against her, but not before launching every torpedo she carried and expending over 3,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. As the valiant destroyer slipped beneath the waves, survivors in the water reported seeing Japanese sailors on nearby ships, standing at attention in tribute to their fallen enemies, a gesture of respect that transcended the hatred of war. Meanwhile, far to the north, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet had finally located Admiral Ozawa's sacrificial carriers and was in the process of destroying them with methodical efficiency. The Princeton, one of Ozawa's light carriers, had already been sunk by submarine attack, while the remaining vessels fought desperately against overwhelming odds. Historical analysis from the Naval WWII College suggests that Ozawa's northern force succeeded brilliantly in its primary mission. Despite its destruction, it had drawn Halsey's powerful fleet away from the critical battle area at the most crucial moment. The Japanese admiral, knowing his ships were doomed from the moment he sailed, had sacrificed his command to give Kurita's center force its best chance of reaching the American landing areas. The irony was bitter. Just as Kurita was withdrawing from his closest approach to victory, the trap that Japanese strategists had so carefully planned was working to perfection. Halsey's carriers were over 300 miles away, engaged in destroying the decoy force, while the path to Leyte Gulf lay wide open before the retiring Japanese battleships and cruisers. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, monitoring the battle from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, felt the weight of command as fragmentary reports filtered in from the scattered actions across hundreds of miles of ocean. The complexity of coordinating multiple task forces engaged in simultaneous battles tested even his considerable strategic skills. Radio messages crossed and recrossed, creating confusion about the actual tactical situation that would not be fully understood until hours after the critical decisions had been made. The escort carrier St. Lo, part of Admiral Felix Budwell Stump's Taffy I, had just survived the morning's surface action when a new threat appeared in the sky above Leyte Gulf. The resulting explosion and fire would claim the St. Lo within 30 minutes, making her the first American ship sunk by this terrible new weapon that would plague the fleet for the remainder of the war. As the sun reached its zenith over the Philippine Sea, the various actions that collectively comprised the Battle of Leyte Gulf began to wind down, but the strategic implications were only beginning to be understood by commanders on both sides. The afternoon of October 25, 1944, brought a deceptive calm to the waters around Leyte Gulf as Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet completed the systematic destruction of Admiral Ozawa's northern force. The Japanese carriers that had once launched the attack on Pearl Harbor were now blazing wrecks, scattered across the Philippine Sea, their aircraft hangars empty monuments to the Imperial Navy's vanished air power. The Zuikaku, veteran of more battles than any carrier in either fleet, finally succumbed to her wounds at 2:14 in the afternoon. Captain Keizuka Takeo ordered abandoned ship as American torpedoes and bombs had turned his proud vessel into a floating inferno. As she rolled over and sank, she took with her not just 843 officers and men, but also the last tangible link to Japanese naval aviation's glory days. The sight of her battle flag disappearing beneath the waves marked the end of an era. In naval warfare, Admiral Ozawa himself, rescued from his sinking flagship Zuikaku by the light cruiser Oyoto, watched the destruction of his command with the stoic acceptance of a samurai. Facing inevitable defeat, his mission had been accomplished. Halsey's powerful fleet had been drawn away from Leyte Gulf at the critical moment, but the price paid by his sailors would haunt him until his death decades later. The three remaining carriers, Chitos, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, had all been sunk or fatally damaged, along with 2 destroyers and a light cruiser. Meanwhile, Admiral Kurita's retreating center force found itself under renewed attack from Admiral Halsey's aircraft as the Third Fleet commander belatedly realized he had been deceived. The Nagato, an elderly battleship that had served as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flagship during the Pearl Harbor attack, absorbed repeated bomb hits that left her barely able to maintain way. The heavy cruiser Kumano, already damaged in the morning's action against Taffy 3, took additional torpedo hits that would eventually prove fatal. According to post-war interviews conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, many Japanese officers expressed amazement at the coordination and effectiveness of American air-sea operations during the battle. The ability of American forces to conduct simultaneous operations across hundreds of miles of ocean while maintaining effective communication and logistical support demonstrated a level of naval sophistication that the Imperial Japanese Navy could no longer match. The human cost of the battle was becoming apparent as rescue operations began throughout the area. The destroyer Johnston survivors, floating in life rafts and clinging to debris, were rescued by both American and Japanese vessels in a rare display of humanity amidst the carnage. Captain Ernest Edwin Evans was not among the survivors. The Native American officer had gone down with his ship after fighting one of the most courageous actions in naval history. His posthumous Medal of Honor would be only partial recognition for his extraordinary leadership. Under impossible circumstances, aboard the surviving ships of Taffy 3, damage control parties worked frantically to repair battle damage, while medical personnel treated the wounded. The escort carrier White Plains bore the scars of near misses from 18-inch shells, her flight deck buckled and her island structure riddled with splinter holes. That she remained afloat and operational testified to both the skill of her crew and the inherent toughness of American shipbuilding. The strategic implications of the battle were already becoming clear to both sides. Japan's remaining surface fleet, though not completely destroyed, had been so severely mauled that it could no longer pose a serious threat to American operations. The loss of trained pilots and aircrew, particularly among the kamikaze attacks that had begun during the battle, represented an irreplaceable drain on Japanese human resources. Most importantly, the failure to disrupt the light landings meant that American forces now had a secure foothold in the Philippines from which to launch the final assault on Japan itself. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, reviewing the preliminary battle reports from his Pearl Harbor headquarters, recognized that the Battle of Leyte Gulf represented a watershed moment in the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy, once the most formidable maritime force in the Pacific, had gambled everything on one desperate throw of the dice and lost. Their remaining ships would spend the rest of the war hiding in ports, gradually succumbing to air attacks and fuel shortages as American forces tightened the noose around the Japanese home islands. The setting sun of October 26, 1944, cast long shadows across the wreckage-strewn waters of the Philippine Sea as rescue vessels from both sides worked to pull survivors from the oil-slick swells. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in human history, had ended not with a single climactic moment, but with the gradual recognition that the Imperial Japanese Navy's last gamble had failed decisively. Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr. stood on the flag bridge of the USS New Jersey, his weathered face reflecting the mixed emotions of victory tinged with regret. His pursuit of the Japanese Northern Force had been tactically successful, for enemy carriers lay on the bottom of the sea, but strategically questionable. The realization that he had been deceived by a brilliantly executed feint would trouble him for years to come. Despite the ultimate American victory, the absence of his powerful fleet during the critical morning hours of October 25th had nearly resulted in disaster for the light landing forces. The final accounting of the battle revealed the magnitude of both victory and sacrifice. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost for aircraft carriers 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, approximately 60% of all vessels committed to the operation. More critically, they had lost irreplaceable pilots, experienced petty officers, and naval aviators whose training had taken years to complete. The human cost exceeded 10,000 Japanese sailors and airmen killed, wounded, or missing. American losses, while significantly lighter, included brave men whose sacrifice had secured victory at the critical moment. The destroyer Johnston, destroyer Hull, destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, and escort carrier Gambier Bay had been sunk, along with the kamikaze victim St. Lo. Over 3,000 American naval personnel had been killed, wounded, or reported missing. But their sacrifice had broken the back of Japanese naval power forever. Post-war analysis by the Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded that the Battle of Leyte Gulf effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct major naval operations, forcing them into a purely defensive posture for the remainder of the war. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility, carefully cultivated since Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905, lay shattered beneath the Philippine Sea. Captain Ernest Edwin Evans' posthumous Medal of Honor citation would read in part, "For extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Johnston in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet. We stand ready," had been proven in the most demanding test imaginable. The strategic consequences of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. With the Japanese Navy neutralized as an effective fighting force, American amphibious operations could proceed without fear of major surface intervention. The invasion of Iwo Jima, the assault on Okinawa, and ultimately the planned invasion of Japan itself became feasible, because the sea lanes were now securely under American control. The timetable for ending the Pacific War had been dramatically accelerated. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports of the disaster from his naval staff, began to contemplate for the first time the possibility that Japan might not achieve the negotiated peace. That had been the goal of their desperate strategy. The loss of the Philippines would sever the supply lines that brought oil from the Dutch East Indies, gradually strangling the Japanese war machine. Without fuel for training, pilot quality would continue to deteriorate, forcing greater reliance on kamikaze tactics that, while spectacular, could not alter the fundamental balance of naval power. General Douglas MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines had been fulfilled, but at a cost measured in the lives of young men who would never see their homes again. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had proven that American industrial might, technological superiority, and individual courage could overcome even the most fanatical resistance. As the last rescue ships departed the battle area, they left behind a graveyard of ships and dreams beneath the peaceful waters of the Philippine Sea. The largest naval battle in history was over, and with it died Japan's last hope of avoiding unconditional surrender. The rising sun flag would continue to fly over the remaining islands of the Pacific Empire, but its light was fading as inexorably as the tropical sunset. That marked the end of Japanese naval supremacy. In the months ahead, American forces would close the ring around the Japanese home islands. But the decisive moment had come in the waters off Leyte Gulf, where courage and sacrifice had purchased victory at the highest price.